In the quietest corners of suburbia, where the streetlights hum and the shadows stretch across manicured lawns, there exists a specific brand of silence that feels heavy, almost sentient. You know the story, or you think you do. A simple job, a dark house, and a telephone that won't stop ringing. But tonight, we aren't just revisiting an urban legend. We are descending into a living nightmare where every ring is a countdown. Kelly adjusted her glasses, the soft glow of the television flickering against the mahogany walls of the sprawling mansion. Outside, the wind rattled the oak branches, casting skeletal shadows that danced across the expensive rug. The Millers were wealthy, the kind of wealthy that bought privacy and silence in equal measure, leaving Kelly alone in a structure that felt more like a museum than a home. She had been here dozens of times, yet tonight the air felt strangely thin, charged with an unspoken tension that made the back of her neck prickle. The twin boys were long asleep, tucked into their designer sheets upstairs, leaving Kelly with nothing but the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the foyer. There is a peculiar vulnerability in being a babysitter. A temporary guardian of lives you didn't create, inside a fortress that isn't your own. Kelly tried to focus on her chemistry homework, but the equations seemed to blur as her eyes drifted toward the dark windows. The glass was so vast, reflecting her own solitary figure back at her, making it impossible to see what might be lurking in the obsidian blackness of the backyard. Every creak of the floorboards felt amplified. Every whisper of the wind against the chimney sounded like a muffled voice. She told herself it was just the isolation playing tricks on her mind, the byproduct of too many horror movies and not enough sleep. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling. When the landline finally rang, the sound was discordant and jarring, slicing through the heavy silence like a razor through silk. Kelly jumped, her pen skittering across the table as she reached for the receiver on the marble countertop. She expected it to be Mrs. Miller checking in, perhaps reminding her about the alarm system or the snacks in the pantry. Instead, when she pressed the phone to her ear, there was nothing but a hollow, rhythmic breathing that seemed to vibrate through the plastic. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vast kitchen. There was no answer, just that steady, chilling inhalation, followed by a sudden click that signaled the line had gone dead. It was a prank, she reasoned, surely. Despite her attempts to rationalize the silence, a cold knot of anxiety began to tighten in her stomach. She sat back down, trying to return to her studies, but her ears were now hyper-tuned to every sound within the house. The mansion felt different now, no longer a sanctuary of luxury, but a labyrinth of dark corners and unlocked doors. She found herself checking the locks on the sliding glass doors, her reflection staring back at her with wide, panicked eyes. The silence that had once been peaceful now felt predatory, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next intrusion. She checked the baby monitor, seeing only the still, gray-scaled images of the sleeping children, their chests rising and falling in rhythm. 10 minutes passed before the phone rang again, its electronic trill echoing through the hallways like a haunting melody. This time, Kelly didn't hesitate. She grabbed the receiver with a trembling hand, determined to tell the caller to stop. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice wavering despite her best efforts to sound stern. A voice replied, a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like dry leaves scraping against a gravestone. "Have you checked the children?" the voice asked, the words slow and deliberate, dripping with a terrifying intimacy. Kelly felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Before she could respond, the line went silent once more, leaving her standing in the kitchen, paralyzed. Her first instinct was to run upstairs, to burst into the bedroom and make sure the boys were still there, safe and sound in their beds. But she stayed frozen, staring at the phone as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the counter. The question was so specific, so pointed, that it felt less like a prank and more like a direct threat. How did the caller know she was there? How did they know there were children to check on? She looked out the kitchen window, searching the tree line for a figure, a light, or any sign of another human being. The world outside remained a void of shadows and rain, offering no answers, only the terrifying realization that she was alone. She eventually forced her feet to move, creeping toward the grand staircase with her breath held tight in her chest. The stairs creaked under her weight, each groan sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet of the house. As she reached the landing, she looked down the long, dark corridor toward the nursery. The door was slightly ajar, just as she had left it, a sliver of soft nightlight spilling out onto the hardwood floor. She approached slowly, her hand resting on the wall for support, her mind racing through 1,000 terrible scenarios. When she peeked inside, she saw the two small shapes under the blankets, perfectly still. They were fine. She exhaled a long, shaky breath, feeling relief. Returning to the living room, Kelly decided she couldn't handle the silence any longer. She picked up the phone and dialed the local police department, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. A bored-sounding dispatcher answered, and Kelly quickly explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. The dispatcher told her to stay calm, that it was likely just someone messing around with a random number generator. However, seeing the genuine distress in Kelly's voice, the dispatcher agreed to put a trace on the line if the caller reached out again. If he calls back, keep him on the line for at least 30 seconds, the officer instructed. That's all we need to pinpoint the location. Just stay calm. Kelly sat on the edge of the sofa, the phone clutched in her lap, watching the digital clock on the microwave. Every second felt like an hour, the ticking of the clock becoming a deafening roar in her ears. She felt exposed, the sheer size of the Millers' home working against her, providing too many places for someone to hide, and not enough places for her to feel secure. She began to wonder if someone was outside in the bushes, watching her through the glass, laughing at her terror. She turned off the living room lights, hoping to hide her silhouette, but the darkness only made the house feel more cavernous. She was trapped in a game she didn't understand, orchestrated by a stranger. Then the phone rang for the third time, a piercing shriek that made her scream aloud. She fumbled with the receiver, her hands slick with sweat, and pressed it to her ear. "I've called the police," she shouted into the mouthpiece, her voice cracking with desperation. "They're tracing this call right now! Leave me alone!" There was a long pause, a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. Then the voice returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a raspy, wet chuckle that seemed to come from the very back of the caller's throat. "Why are you so scared, Kelly?" the voice asked, using her name. "I'm just making sure you're doing your job. Are they breathing?" The mention of her name sent a jolt of pure electricity through her spine, grounding her in a reality that was far more dangerous than she had imagined. This wasn't a random prank. This was personal. The caller knew her, or at least he knew who was supposed to be in the house that night. She glanced at the clock, her eyes fixed on the seconds ticking by. 10 seconds. 15. She had to keep him talking, just like the dispatcher said. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. "What do you want from us?" The voice laughed again, a sound that lacked any humanity. "I want you to look closer, Kelly," he said. "They look so peaceful." Her heart stopped. The implication of his words hit her like a physical blow, a wave of nausea rolling over her as she thought of the two still forms in the upstairs bedroom. She looked at the phone, then back toward the stairs, the darkness of the upper floor now appearing like the mouth of a waiting beast. Just as she was about to scream, the landline beeped, indicating a second incoming call. She looked at the caller ID, and her breath hitched. It was the police station. She clicked over frantically, her voice a sob. "Did you get it?" she cried out. "Did you trace the call?" The dispatcher's voice came through, but it was urgent, sharp, and laced with panic. "Kelly, listen to me very carefully," the dispatcher said, her words coming out in a clipped, frantic staccato. "We got the trace, but there's something wrong. We ran it 3 times to be sure, and the signal is clear." Kelly gripped the phone so hard her knuckles turned white, her eyes darting toward the dark hallway that led to the children's wing. The dispatcher took a sharp breath, the sound of sirens already beginning to wail in the far distance, but they felt miles away from the silent house. "You need to get out of there right now," the officer commanded, her voice trembling. "Don't go for the kids. Don't grab your things. Just run." "The calls are coming from inside." The silence that followed the dispatcher's terrifying command was not empty. It was heavy, a suffocating presence that seemed to solidify the very air around Kelly's lungs. Her heart, once a frantic drum, now felt like a dying bird fluttering against the cage of her ribs, each beat a painful reminder of her own fragile mortality. The phone slipped slightly in her sweat-slicked palm, the plastic casing feeling unnervingly cold against her flushed skin. She didn't move, her feet rooted to the polished hardwood floor as if she had become a permanent fixture of the miller's ornate foyer. The dispatcher's voice continued to crackle with desperate instructions, but the words were now just a meaningless blur of static against the overwhelming realization that she was not alone. Every shadow in the living room now possessed a sharp, jagged edge, stretching across the expensive rugs like grasping fingers. The architecture of the house, which had seemed so modern and welcoming only hours ago, had transformed into a labyrinth designed to confuse and entrap her. She looked toward the grand staircase, the dark woods spiraling upward into a darkness that felt sentient and hungry. The dispatcher had told her to run, to abandon the children and save herself. But the thought of those 2 small, innocent souls upstairs acted as a tether, pulling against the primal urge to flee into the cold night. She was caught in a paralyzing intersection of duty and terror, her mind fracturing under the weight of an impossible, life-altering choice.
Memories of the town's darker history began to bleed into her consciousness. Stories whispered in high school hallways about the man who lived in the crawl spaces of suburban dreams. They called him the Hollow Guest, a figure of urban legend who didn't want money, but simply the intimacy of a shared, secret domesticity. Whether he was a ghost or a flesh-and-blood predator mattered little in this moment of crystalline fear. Kelly remembered the local news reports from 3 years ago regarding a similar incident in the neighboring county, where a family had vanished without a single struggle, leaving behind nothing but a half-eaten dinner and a ringing telephone. The chilling parallels were now impossible to ignore as the floorboards above her groaned under a sudden weight.
A soft, rhythmic thudding began to emanate from above, a sound so subtle it might have been her own pulse if it weren't for the distinct timing of footsteps. Someone was walking across the master bedroom, their weight shifting with a deliberate, slow precision that suggested they were savoring the moment of discovery. The killer wasn't rushing, he was performing, turning a simple home invasion into a grand psychological theater where Kelly was the unwilling protagonist. She realized with a jolt of horror that the second line was still active, the killer likely listening to her every breath through the extension in the upstairs hallway. He was partaking in her fear, drinking it in like a fine vintage wine in the total dark. She took a tentative step toward the kitchen, her eyes never leaving the top of the stairs, where the railing cast long, skeletal shadows against the wallpaper. The kitchen was a sea of stainless steel and marble, a cold environment that offered no sanctuary. Her mind raced through the layout of the ground floor, searching for a weapon, but the knife block felt leagues away, a distance that felt insurmountable in her current state of paralysis. Every hum of the refrigerator, every groan of the heating vents sounded like a footstep, a whisper, or a wheezing breath. The house was breathing with her, a symbiotic relationship born of terror, as the walls seemed to pulse with the rhythmic vibration of a hidden, malicious presence. "Kelly," a voice whispered, But it didn't come from the phone. It was a soft, sibilant hiss that seemed to drift down from the air conditioning vents, a sound so intimate it felt like a caress against her ear. She froze, her eyes widening as she scanned the ceiling, her breath catching in her throat. The killer was using the house itself to communicate, perhaps familiar with the intricate ductwork, or simply standing over a vent in the room directly above her. The level of premeditation was staggering, suggesting that this wasn't a random act of violence, but a meticulously planned execution. He had chosen this house, he had chosen this night, and most terrifyingly of all, he had chosen her to witness it. She remembered the back door, a heavy sliding glass portal that led to the manicured garden and the safety of the perimeter fence. If she could just reach it, she could be out in the open air, away from the claustrophobic walls and the invisible eyes. She began to creep toward the back of the house, her movements feline and desperate, avoiding the patches of moonlight that spilled through the windows. The darkness was her only ally, yet it was also the domain of the man upstairs. As she reached the handle of the sliding door, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of light in the crushing gloom. But as she pulled, the door didn't budge. The lock was jammed. Panicked, she looked through the glass and saw something that made her blood turn to ice. A set of muddy footprints led from the garden directly to the basement bulkhead, which stood wide open like a gaping wound in the earth. He hadn't just entered the house. He had established a base of operations beneath her feet. The realization that he could be anywhere, behind a door, under a bed, or inside the very walls, shattered her remaining composure. She wasn't just being hunted. She was being toyed with in a cage of her own making. The dispatcher's voice on the phone had gone silent, replaced by a low, rhythmic breathing that signaled the killer had picked up the extension again. "The locks won't save you, Kelly," he murmured, his voice sounding much closer now, as if he were standing just around the corner of the pantry. "I've been here since before the Millers left. I watched you arrive. I watched you make the popcorn. I watched you read to them." The level of voyeurism made her skin crawl. The thought of his eyes on her while she was in her most vulnerable moments of domestic boredom. He had been a silent observer of her life for hours, a ghost in the machinery of the household. She realized then that the phone calls weren't just threats. They were a countdown, a way for him to measure her escalating, delicious terror. She backed away from the jammed door, her heels clicking softly against the tile, a sound that felt like a death knell in the silent kitchen. She had to get to the children. Even if it meant walking directly into the lion's den, she couldn't leave them alone with a monster who knew the secrets of their home better than they did. She began to move toward the service stairs, a narrow, steep staircase used by the cleaning staff that led directly to the nursery. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to bypass the main hallway where he likely expected her to go. Every step was an agony of anticipation, her ears straining for the sound of a closing door. The air in the service stairwell was stale and cold, smelling of old wood and lemon polish. As she ascended, the sounds from the main part of the house became muffled, replaced by the heavy thumping of her own heart. She reached the small landing and pressed her ear against the door that led to the upstairs hallway. Silence. A deep, unnatural silence that felt more threatening than any scream. She slowly turned the brass knob, the metal feeling like a frozen relic in her hand. The door creaked, a high-pitched, agonizing sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. She winced, closing her eyes and praying that the killer was occupied in the master suite. Stepping out into the hallway, she saw that the door to the children's room was cracked open just an inch. A faint blue glow from the nightlight spilled out onto the carpet, illuminating a trail of dark, wet droplets that led from the main staircase directly to the nursery door. Her breath hitched as she realized the droplets weren't water. They were thick, dark, and possessed a metallic sheen that could only be blood. The urge to scream was almost physical, a pressurized force building in her throat,
but she clamped her hand over her mouth, tasting the salt of her own tears. She moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle.
As her fingers brushed the cold wood of the nursery door, a realization colder than the winter air struck her. The trail of blood didn't start from the stairs. It started from inside the room and led out. The door swung open further under the slight pressure of her touch, revealing a room that was far too quiet. The beds were rumpled but empty, and the window was wide open, the curtains fluttering like ghostly wings in the wind. Just as she turned to run, a hand emerged from the shadows behind the door, not reaching for her throat, but holding a small silver key that Kelly recognized instantly. It was the key to the basement, and it was covered in fresh, warm red. The metallic scent of blood filled the small room, thick and cloying as it mixed with the innocent smell of baby powder and fabric softener. Kelly froze, her muscles locking into a rigid, trembling pillar of terror as the hand extended further, dangling the basement key like a macabre prize. The silver metal shimmered under the pale blue nightlight, the viscous red fluid dripping slowly onto the carpet with a soft, rhythmic thud. She wanted to scream, but her throat had constricted into a dry, narrow tunnel, allowing only shallow, jagged breaths to pass. The shadows behind the nursery door seemed to coalesce, taking the form of a tall, imposing figure whose presence sucked the remaining warmth from the air. This was the source of those haunting phone calls, the voice that had violated her sanctuary. Every instinct screamed at her to move, but her feet felt as though they were rooted in concrete. The figure stepped slowly from behind the door, revealing a face obscured by a crude, hand-stitched mask that looked like it had been fashioned from old upholstery. The eyes behind the jagged slits were dark and void of any recognizable human emotion, reflecting only a predatory focus that made her skin crawl. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The heavy silence of the house was his weapon, a suffocating blanket that amplified the sound of her own thundering heart. In his other hand, he held a jagged piece of glass, likely from a broken frame, which glinted with a lethal, polished sharpness. Kelly realized then that the children were gone, and she was the final piece of his game. A sudden burst of adrenaline shattered her paralysis as the intruder took a deliberate step toward her. She lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the swipe of the glass shard that whistled through the air where her neck had been seconds before. She scrambled toward the hallway, her socks slipping on the hardwood floor as she fought for traction. The killer didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, measured confidence, knowing that every exit was a trap and every shadow was his ally. Kelly reached the top of the stairs, her mind racing through the geography of the house, looking for any possible means of escape. The front door was too far, and the back door was locked from the inside with a deadbolt. Her only hope was the phone, and the help that was hopefully already on its way. She tumbled down the stairs, the edges of the wooden steps bruising her ribs and hips, but she barely felt the pain over the roar of the blood in her ears. At the bottom, she scrambled to her feet, gasping for air that tasted like copper and old dust. She glanced back to see the figure silhouetted against the nursery light, a dark shadow descending the stairs with rhythmic, heavy thuds. He was playing with her, enjoying the hunt, savoring the visceral terror that emanated from her like a scent. Kelly dove into the kitchen, her hands frantically searching the countertops for the cordless phone she had dropped earlier. Her fingers finally brushed against the plastic casing, and she pulled it close, hoping to hear the voice of the operator, a tether to the world she'd lost. "Help me! He's here! He's inside!" She hissed into the receiver, her voice breaking into a jagged sob. A muffled voice responded, but it wasn't the calm, professional tone of the police dispatcher. It was a distorted electronic garble that sounded like 1,000 dying radio signals. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had jammed the signal, or perhaps he had been controlling the line from the start. The police she thought she had spoken to might have been just another layer of his elaborate deception. Panic, cold and absolute, began to drown her. She looked toward the basement door, remembering the key held by the killer. If the children weren't in their room and the window was open as a decoy, they had to be down there. With a desperate surge of courage, she grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, the weight of it giving her a momentary sense of power. She didn't head for the basement. Instead, she bolted for the mudroom, hoping to find the spare key her mother always kept hidden in a ceramic jar. Her fingers found the jar, but as she tipped it over, only dry earth and dead insects spilled out. He had anticipated her every move, stripping away her defenses one by one until she was left with nothing but her own will to survive. The sound of the killer's footsteps reached the kitchen floor, the slow, deliberate gait of a man who knew his prey had no more places to hide. She backed into the pantry, the darkness swallowing her whole. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the distant, rhythmic wail of a siren, a sound so beautiful it felt like a choir of angels. The killer paused, his head tilting toward the sound like an animal catching a scent on the wind. The police were coming. The trace had worked, or perhaps a neighbor had seen something through the windows. This was her only chance. As the intruder turned his head, Kelly lunged from the pantry, swinging the skillet with every ounce of strength her terror-fueled muscles could muster. The heavy metal connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack, sending him reeling back against the kitchen island. He didn't fall, but he was dazed, the glass shards slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor in a million glittering fragments. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She ran for the basement door, knowing the lock was likely engaged from the other side, but she threw her shoulder against the wood with frantic desperation. To her shock, the door gave way instantly, swinging open into a black abyss. She tumbled down the wooden steps, her hands reaching out to catch herself before she hit the cold concrete floor. In the corner, huddled behind the furnace, she saw two small, shivering forms. The children were alive, their eyes wide with a horror that no child should ever know, their mouths taped shut with heavy silver strips. They weren't bleeding. The blood she had seen on the key and in the nursery was a distraction, a cruel psychological trick to break her. Kelly gathered them into her arms, the small bodies shaking so violently she feared they might break. She whispered words of comfort she didn't believe herself, her eyes locked on the open basement door above. The sirens were louder now, the blue and red lights beginning to pulse against the small, high windows of the cellar. She heard the front door being kicked open, the heavy boots of officers hitting the floorboards, and the authoritative shouts that signaled the end of the nightmare. But above her, the kitchen was silent. The killer was gone. He had vanished back into the shadows of the house, perhaps through the very window he had left open in the nursery, disappearing into the cold night as if he were nothing more than a ghost. The police found her in the basement, clutching the children so tightly they had to gently pry her fingers away. They searched every inch of the property, from the attic to the crawl spaces, but the man with the stitched mask was nowhere to be found. They found the discarded key, the broken glass, and the bloody trail, which they later discovered was nothing more than theatrical stage blood mixed with animal remains. It was a calculated, sadistic performance. As they wrapped Kelly in a shock blanket and led her to the ambulance, she looked back at the house, its grand facade now looking like a hollow skull. The calls had come from inside, but the true horror was the realization that he had been watching her for weeks, learning her soul. Months later, the physical bruises had healed, but the psychological scars remained as deep, jagged trenches in Kelly's mind. She moved to a different city, changed her number, and never took a babysitting job again. Yet the sound of a ringing phone still sent her into a state of paralyzed hypervigilance. The mystery of the intruder was never solved. No suspect was ever identified, and no motive was ever found. He had simply chosen her, a random target for a masterclass in terror. The police files remained open, a cold testament to the night the walls of a safe home became the bars of a cage. She learned to live in the light, avoiding the shadows that gathered in the corners of rooms, but she knew he was still out there. This story became a legend, A cautionary tale whispered by teenagers around campfires and at sleepovers, a reminder that the greatest threats aren't always outside the door. It serves as a chilling testament to the fragility of our perceived security and the dark potential of the human mind to craft nightmares from the mundane. We build our lives around the idea of safety, trusting in locks, alarms, and the distance between us and the unknown. Yet we forget that the most terrifying monsters are the ones that find a way to step over our thresholds unnoticed. The babysitter and the phone call is more than a ghost story. It is a primal scream echoing through the halls of our collective consciousness, reminding us that sometimes the call is from home. In the end, the silence of the night is never truly empty. It is filled with the potential for the unimaginable. Kelly's journey through that house of horrors concludes not with a clean resolution, but with a lingering, haunting question that remains unanswered for us all. We must ask ourselves if we are ever truly alone, or if the shadows are simply waiting for the right moment to speak. As the sun sets and the lights flicker on in quiet neighborhoods, the legend persists, a dark thread woven into the fabric of our modern mythology. Sleep well, lock your doors, and if the phone rings in the dead of night asking if the children are safe, remember that the most dangerous presence is often the one you cannot see.